I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question, because it's a whole big fat hoax. It's just a hoax.
All right, just the question itself and the president having to respond to it says something about the times in which we live. The president dismissing that New York Times report that the FBI was looking into the possibility that the president of the United States was working essentially as a Russian agent. Let's talk to Virginia Democratic Senator, the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee there, Mark Warner. Senator, good to have you.
Hey, thanks, Neil.
Now, much has been made of the fact that the president, of course, with these private Putin conversations, instructed his interpreter to hand him over the notes and the translations and not share them with anyone. That raised concerns for you. Right?
Well, it did, Neil, because, I mean, the president's got the right to meet with other world leaders one-on-one, but at least traditionally, presidents want to make sure that at least their top advisors get a full readout. And if you've got a one-on-one meeting, you'd think you'd want your Secretary of Defense or your Vice President, your top leaders, to get a look at some of the notes that the interpreter may have taken. That raises some questions. It also raises questions, again, I know the president likes to dismiss the Mueller investigation, but there's been over 30 indictments. There's been 7 folks that have pled guilty. And there were questions raised not just by our committee, but by an awful lot of folks from both parties that wondered why Donald Trump, throughout the whole campaign, who was willing to criticize virtually every other world leader, and for that matter, Republicans and Democrats alike, the one guy he wouldn't criticize was Vladimir Putin. And then we had this meeting where President and Putin were together in Helsinki. And Neil, I got to tell you, I was embarrassed for our country the way that Trump seemed to kowtow to the Russian leaders there in Helsinki.
On that issue, not to interrupt you there, but the president had said, and you can't blame him if this is the case, that soon after he became president, phone conversations he had with world leaders, including those of Australia and others, Russian ministers, had suddenly leaked out. So he might have been unusually concerned that such conversations were going to be leaked out, this one included. And so out of abundance of caution not to tell anyone because you're suspicious of everyone.
Well, again, that would make me, if I was running that kind of operation, I would look at my folks who are around me and try to get rid of the folks who are leaking. But
well, we don't know. When you don't know, you don't know, and a lot of people have left since, right?
But I guess, Neil, what I would say, though, is, why wouldn't the President of the United States want to share, at least with his closest advisors, what he's saying with someone who I think most Americans would agree is a rival, if not an adversary, in the form of Vladimir Putin, particularly since we now have bipartisan consensus, at least from the Intelligence Committee, that Russians and Russian agents tried to interfere in the 2016 election in an effort to help Trump and hurt Clinton. That much at least has been pretty well established.
But if you think that's true, right, Senator? I mean,
sir.
if he were in the tank for Vladimir Putin, he wouldn't have ticked off Putin to the degree he did on a number of key decisions, including actions we took in the Middle East, the Syria withdrawal notwithstanding. But more to the point, when lecturing them on OPEC and production levels and telling them not to do this, and alienating himself, especially with the Ukrainian dust-up and with the Russians, to force them to cease and desist. So it's not as if that is the action of someone beholden to the Russians, he's spiked it sometimes, right?
Well, Neil, I guess I would simply say, if you look at most of the sanctions that have been put in place, they were put in place by Congress, not by the Trump administration. I still think it would be hard for me to find an example where Donald Trump has actually said a bad word about Vladimir Putin. Lord knows he's said a bad word about everybody else in the world, and he's ecumenical even in terms of American politics, in terms of saying things about Democrats or Republicans.
But you really have to follow his actions. Let's say he hasn't said a bad word, and he has said some nasty stuff to him now and then, but I mean, if he were beholden to the guy, he wouldn't do things that infuriated the Russians, particularly speaking out the way he did on Ukraine, etc. Now, you're quite right. Now, that could just be cover or whatever. But is it your sense with the Mueller investigation that you talk about indictments and all that have been made, most of them having to do more with business dealings than outright collusion? Is it your sense that Mueller investigation in the end will be more about those business dealings than anything having to do with Russia? Obviously investigations soon follow their own route. Bill Clinton's did. So I'm wondering what you think will ultimately be that Mueller probe finding.
I can tell you what what we have found. I mean, and some of this is we've already become public with. Russians intervened. They used social media in massive ways. They hacked into our not very safe electoral systems. I think we've gotten better on a series of those fronts. But it was a foreign government interfering in our political process to help one candidate and harm another. I think there is an extra high scrutiny then that is going to, this president or any president who receives such kind of assistance is going to be under. And if Donald Trump says that there's no there, then go ahead and let the Mueller investigation finish, run its course. Frankly, if Mr. Trump wasn't out tweeting every day about the Mueller investigation, or virtually every day, chances are it would have already been finished.
We'll never know that, will we? But let me get your sense, Senator, about the ongoing shutdown now in its 24th day. Number on both parties have looked at ways to improve this. We talked to your colleague from Wisconsin, Republican Senator Johnson, who wants to rehire or pay those deemed to be important and consequential federal workers who are right now laid off, about half of them, I believe. How do you feel about that?
I think we ought to get the government reopened. And listen, I'm for increased border security. I think we ought to determine how that money is best spent. But the thing I've started looking at is you know, Donald Trump said he was a great deal maker. As Neil, as you know, I was in business longer than politics. I was then governor of a state that I had a 2-to-1 Republican legislature. But we got stuff done. I actually think when business schools or management consultants will look back on the way Trump has dealt with this shutdown, it's going to be a case study on how not to negotiate. I mean, rule number one.
But for your party as well, Senator?
Well, listen, I think there needs to be giving on both. But let me just go through really quickly.
Real quick.
You know, if you're trying to do a deal, you try to make both sides come out win-win. There's none of that. You try to make sure that if you empower folks to negotiate for you, you don't chop their knees off the way he did with the vice president, with Lindsey Graham and others. Third thing is, you try to make sure you've got people that are going to tell you truth to power, and he doesn't have anybody in the White House. And finally, if you're running an organization, and if you're running an organization and you want your workforce to go through this, you don't leave your workforce hanging out to dry the way he has. I actually think, again, we don't know how this is all going to play out, but I think business schools will write case studies about how not to negotiate the way Mr. Trump has
I guess it could work both ways, because I do see it. I've plenty of fault to go on both sides here, to your point, Senator. But, you know, I do remember, I don't know how you voted on this, so I apologize. But I do know that a number of Democrats supported, you know, wall building and that kind of activity, 136 miles worth during the Barack Obama administration. So I'm wondering when they throw up their arms in a fit, whether that's just theater and nothing to do with reality.
I wasn't here when that vote took place, but what I would say is,
well, a lot of your colleagues are ranting and raving were.
But let me just,
you know, it sounds weird, right?
But here's what I'd say is, you know, we need to spend more money on border security. I'm all in for that. I think what happened was they built borders and barriers in the highest populated areas where it was the most needed. But technology has changed even since then. I would, listen, if we could agree on a set amount and then let's leave it to the experts to decide how we can best secure our borders, I think we could both sides get to yes.
Senator Warner, thank you for taking the time. We do appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Neil.
Ken Starr, former Whitewater Independent Counsel now, and author of the new book, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation, is with me now. Good to see you. Let's start with the movement of those notes. We know early in the administration there were phone calls that were leaked that the president was having with leaders. So we understand the leaking that might have been going on or that went on. But what do you make of this meeting with Russia and there not being notes? Well,
I think there is. We need to know more, Harris, in a nutshell. But of course, they should not be made public. And I gather there's now going to be a House or Senate inquiry into that, so we will learn more. But I view this is the president's prerogative. The president of the United States is elected to handle the foreign policy of the United States, and obviously there's a congressional oversight function. So this is his determination. Now, if there is some suggestion of something inappropriate, improper, or whatever, then that raises a very different question. But we haven't heard that. We just heard in very general terms, and now just the report that we just heard is, no, there were other people in the room. This president is unorthodox. Let's face it. He marches to the beat of his own drummer, and so right now it would appear that it's much ado about very little, if not nothing.
So when you hear the president call members of the FBI and former Director James Comey, quote, dirty cops, what do you make of that language?
Well, I wish he wouldn't use that language, but I must say, when I heard about this report from the New York Times about the counterintelligence investigation, I was absolutely stunned. Stunned that the FBI would do it. I have the greatest and highest regard for the FBI, its agents. The leadership of the past has been exemplary. Judge Bill Webster, Judge Louis Freeh, these are men of great, great integrity. Something has gone wrong, and I hope it's being straightened out by Director Wray. This never should have been. I cannot imagine the audacity and the poor judgment based upon what we know of saying that we're going to investigate the President of the United States or launch an inquiry as to whether he is somehow in league with Russia. I think it really is quite extraordinary. It's appalling. It's another sad dimension of the recent chapter of the history of a great organization that we all look to do very important work.
You know, I want to ask you about timing and optics and the perception. So the White House knows that there are investigations looking at whether or not there was collusion or I should say conspiracy, obstruction of justice, whatever that investigation now has moved to with the president and Russia. That's been over a year now. Why not put stuff on the record with Russia if you know you're already being looked at? And as counsel, I wonder if you would tell your client that.
Well, it would be, you gather all the facts, Harris, as you know, just as a journalist does, and you assess those facts, and then you come to a judgment. But we're dealing here with an exquisitely sensitive issue of foreign policy and foreign relations, and that is uniquely entrusted to the president's judgment. Now, this president frequently says, I go by my instincts and not necessarily by my judgment. But he leads us to therefore, I think, raise questions about his instincts that I think are frankly unnecessary, because the facts of these last now 2 years suggest that he does listen to those around him, and he's guided, he's restrained by them and so forth in terms of, okay, we're not going to do that, even though his instincts are taking him in a different direction. But I think the president could help himself, frankly, by using less, shall I say, stringent, strong language. But I think he is totally justified in condemning the FBI for the idea of investigating the President of the United States, in essence, for treason or something pretty close to that. That's shocking.
Ken Starr, first time with you on the program, outnumbered over time, sir. Good to have your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris.